hello everyone. I'm Samar Singla, and I'm the founder and CEO of Click Labs. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we do. So essentially, you you all know what crowdsourcing is, but what we are trying to do is essentially solve the problem of how to build crowdsourcing products. Because today, crowdsourcing as a concept is evolving to is giving birth to a lot of products, and we are basically trying to make that process easier and faster for entrepreneurs, for corporations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what can corporations do, how can they bring crowdsourcing into their processes, and how can they make crowdsourcing work for them. So essentially, I'll start with some trends. So if you look at what is happening in commercial space, in corporation space because of crowdsourcing. So there are these three trends that are being seen right now. So one is economy of scale is being replaced by economy of platform. So essentially, what that means is that corporations used to be, the bigger corporation would be more powerful because they would not have downtimes, they would not have peaks, they would be able to handle peak demands better because of economies of scale. So that is being replaced by economies of platform because essentially the crowd is elastic. So it scales automatically. So you don't need a very large scale to actually get those same economies. And secondly, on a consumer side, ownership is giving way to consumption on demand. So what people earlier used to own, Uber is a perfect example. A lot of people have actually stopped buying cars because of Uber. Same Airbnb. People are not going to hotels, and that's also kind of temporary ownership. So that's another trend. And thirdly, digital platforms are bypassing traditional infrastructure. So if you look at this trend is actually much more visible in developing countries like India, where all the bigger corporations are actually saying that they don't want to own anything. They don't want to own any infrastructure. So the ownership is actually so fragmented that these bigger companies are just aggregating those. So these are the trends that are because of crowdsourcing. And so this is, a very nice graphic I wanted to show. This is by one of big authorities in crowdsourcing, Jeremiah Owang. So he has been working a lot on this stuff, and he made this. So I wanted to show this graphic to you. So essentially, if you look at all the segments that are being disrupted, so money, goods, food, services, transportation, space, all these companies are essentially based upon the trends that I spoke about are disrupting these spaces, these verticals. And so if you are an enterprise or even a startup, right? So the idea is to first decide what do you want to crowdsource? What is the area? What is the front end that you want to crowdsource at, right? So it could be demand side, it could be supply side, it could be logistics side. So I'll give you some examples. So basically, on the demand side, what you are doing essentially is you're creating demand by using the power of crowd, right? It's essentially what typically marketers do, but it's a different format because the crowd is not owning anything. So they're just using your products or services. So BMW is doing this, which is BMW as a service, and then Nordstrom's clothes on demands, Home Depot's Christmas trees on demands. In all these cases, nobody really owns anything, but these companies are using crowdsourcing to actually generate demands for their products. Similarly, if you look at supply side, so Gap and Coke, they are basically creating supply, which is workforce in this case, through crowdsourcing. So it's more like, they have these times of peak demand when they need more workforce, but it's probably like 2 hours in a particular day, and then they can get these on-demand workforces, which is essentially creating supply for them. And after that, there is a third element, which is logistics. So companies like Walgreens have tied up with TaskRabbit to do their logistics for them. So essentially, they are outsourcing or crowdsourcing their logistics to the crowd using these platforms. And when you think of, once you have thought of what area you want to crowdsource from a company perspective, the second step is the process, right? How would you really want to go about this process? Because a lot of times, whatever you want to start, most of the times actually, companies start with one problem statement, they end up at some other problem statement. So you don't really want to spend a lot of time and resources building some fancy product and really spending a lot of time and resources on that when you realize that it is actually not a good idea, or it has some problem like a huge issue. Either it could be legal, it could be technical, or something like that. So essentially you start with discovery. So you want to know, you just don't want to crowdsource because it's just crowdsourcing, but it has to make sense. It has to be a meaningful problem. So essentially peak demand is a meaningful problem. You want to solve it, you can do it through crowdsourcing. So that's the discovery phase. And after that, you want to find out, if people are going to like it, right? It can be a very good problem, but people might just not like it. I mean, it could be it could be a privacy issue, for example, right? So you might not be able to implement it. So people have to like it. And third is efficiency. It has to be scalable, because if you crowdsource and it is not scalable in concept, then it is a problem, right? So you have to kind of make sure that at scale also it brings efficiencies. And I know somebody said scale is not important. I mean, but when we're talking from a business sense, we have to, this is at the end of the day from a business perspective, right? And then finally you have to scale. So where, I'll mostly talk about the technology aspects of scale, but the idea is that the idea inherently has to be scalable, right? So it should be a convergent idea, not a divergent one. So in the discovery phase, basically what you should ideally do is, if you are a project manager or even an entrepreneur starting to think about starting a crowdsourcing product, right? So products are the same. So you typically should build a very bare bones front end. It could be like a small web page. It could even be a phone number, right? And the idea is that you just see if people like it, if people call that phone, if people fill that form, so that you can actually see, if it's not just you who like that idea, but somebody else also likes it. And then, once you see that okay, people are once you see that people are liking it, and you have some feedback that shows you that this is something that will work, you should actually get into validation phase, which means building an MVP, which is a minimal viable product. So some features of a minimal viable product are, you identify a core product, right? I'll give you an example of this thing using Airbnb as an example. I guess most people know about it. So if you look at Airbnb, so there are a few aspects. There is you can find a room, you can see the schedule, and then, essentially book a room and then do a lot of communication. So when they built their MVP, they found that the core product is essentially finding and matching the room, right? So they did not do anything else. All the messaging, everything, they are all bells and whistles. So that's this stage. In this stage, you should find out what your core is and just strip out every other feature, because that can be built later. So after that, there is efficiency. So this is the phase when once you have set up a MVP, so typically what we suggest as a technology company would be that you see where things are breaking. So you in this efficiency phase, you start identifying bottlenecks, set up analytics, so you can see what is the area which is taking most time, which is the highest friction step, and you start automating that process, right? Building the product in a way to automate that process, and that refines the user experience. So essentially, you start doing that. And so this is where you iterate a lot. And finally, there is the scale phase, where you will actually, start to grow exponentially. So during this phase, what you would do is you would try to be very, very proactive. So you will start to kind of fill in big servers here. You'll try to see what kind of legal issues you might have, what kind of privacy issues you might have, and also you want to set up your technology in a way that you can scale at least 10 times of what you are at any given time. So generally what we say is, if you are at 100 users, well, in the scale phase, you'll probably be at about 100,000 users. So you should be able to handle 1 million users at that point. That should be your ideal goal. So whatever users you have, plan for at least 10 times. So now these are some of the core components of any crowdsourced marketplace, right? Of any crowdsourced mobile app, or let's say call it Airbnb of something, or Uber of something. So there is aggregation. So you essentially are, because it's crowdsourcing, that's the most important thing. Aggregation has to be very seamless. So it has to be very, very easy for the crowd to come on the platform, right? And scheduling. So essentially, most of the time, what happens is this scheduling happens two sides. One is on the consumer side, one is on the supply side, one is on the demand side. So essentially, you have to build the scheduling to be, it's more like a matching engine where you are scheduling on. So to give you an example, if I'm doing something on TaskRabbit, as a supplier, I'm actually scheduling my free time, and as a consumer, I'm scheduling my needs. So basically, you have to build this two-sided scheduling. And after that, there is profiling. So by profiling, I mean that it's essential part of matching. So for any demand or supply to be matched, you have to understand the profile on both sides of the consumer and the supplier. And finally, there is matching. Once you have profiles on supply side, demand side, and then parameters which generally the demand side, the consumer dictates, you build a matching engine to match this supply and demand in real time. Most of the times, real time. And finally, there's notification, which is the communication that happens during last miles. Then there is tracking, which may or may not be the case with every crowdsourced product, but it is pretty important for products like Uber, Airbnb, and such. Then there is payments. Because with crowdsourcing, you don't really know whom you are paying to, what country he or she is in. So it's very, the profiling is not that strong. So if you are receiving payment through a bank, there's a proper KYC process. But with crowdsourcing, that's not the case. Because of that, the payments are a little more fluid in the sense. And finally, there's curation. So you want to make sure that the marketplace experience is great. So you have to ensure that any bad experience, either from supply side or demand side, is actually reported, and that's where the curation piece comes in. So basically, our product is Juggernaut, which is a technology layer that powers crowdsourcing platforms. And what we have done some research, and what we have seen is that people generally want their product, their final product, to be very, very custom, to be very specific to their needs. But the backend technology is fairly generic. It can be modularized. So we have modularized the core technology backend, but the front end is generally built custom to anybody's needs, be it depending upon the area where the product is going to be implemented and things like that. So this is the architecture as it looks like from a technology standpoint. So the lowest layer is a pretty standard web services layer, which I think all the technology people will, it's a standard mean stack basically. And the second layer is what really is our IP. So all the components that I just explained to you in the second last slide are basically these. So we have built these in a modular fashion so that they stay in a layer, and then they can be, they work on this mean stack, and they can actually interface to the top layer using APIs. And Finally, the topmost layer is generally built custom, depending upon what the experience is demanding, and that is something that we generally do on a use case basis. So that's pretty much it. That's what we are trying to do. And, so if you have any questions,
right? Absolutely. Yeah, so I have a question, but I'd like to also open the air, at least like the 2 questions here from the public. You mentioned all these special payments. How important is payments?
So see, payment is very important from 2 perspectives. One is legal aspects. I mean, you don't want to pay somebody and not pay taxes on that. So from that aspect, you have to be legally very sound. So there are things like service taxes. The taxation is a very important aspect of it. And second is the technology behind payments. How do you actually make the payment? So, for that is comparatively the easy bit, because there are a lot of payment gateways to do that. But the complicated bit is to actually make sure that you're not flouting any law, for which you generally don't want to grow too fast and roll out in every single country in the world possible, because with crowdsourcing, it's generally possible, right, from a technology perspective, but you should not do that from a legal standpoint.
Great. Question?
Hi, Samir. Your slides were really impressive.
Thank you.
I'm Siddhi from TIE. Brief question, which might benefit the whole audience. Is it possible if you could share your slides with us? Because I saw the maximum number of clicks when your slides were on.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Hi, Samir. Again, thanks for the very interesting presentation. My name is Imran. I'm from a company called SGS. I'm quite actually very, we are thinking about the same lines of building custom front ends and something which is more generic on the back end. I know it's a little bit detailed, but very briefly, can you give some examples how you have utilized this modular architecture that you have for two different applications? I mean, how does it really work in practical aspect?
So see, essentially there are 2 aspects to it. One is generalizing the functions, right? So you have to, for example, if you take the scheduling piece, right, you have to generalize all the ways it can functionally work, right? How much granularity you want, and so on and so forth. So once you generalize this functionality, then you really build a block that does all these things as a black box and build hooks that APIs can connect to. So the idea is to get this black box to do everything in the most general form possible, and make sure you only interact with this black box using APIs. So only then the modular approach will work. So essentially, in our case, these blocks generally sit on different servers even, because they're all just talking through an API. That's the difficult piece. Only then you can use that in a generic form. So in fact, one of the videos, I couldn't show it, that's what I wanted to show. The video shows that it's one of our products called Jugnu in India. It's actually doing food delivery, grocery delivery, and auto rickshaw rides on one product. So at the back end, there's only all these modules that behave very, very differently on the front end, but at the back end, it's the same technology. So
very cutting edge, huh? Really good.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you so much.